Okay, welcome to this video on inputs and outputs of cells. Slightly different format, let's give it a go. Okay, so the student learning outcomes for this topic around that cells require an input and output of materials in order to survive. Which materials they need in and out depends on whether they are autotrophic or heterotrophic, and we'll talk about those things. And the substances that need to move in and out go through some different mechanisms. So those are just outlined in this video, and then each of those different topics I'll go through in separate videos. So if we think about the cell as a system here, in order to make macromolecules and survive, we've got a few steps that need to happen along the way. So for cells to grow and reproduce, they need to be able to make these macromolecules, and the pathways they use are called anabolic pathways that build things up. To do this, they need the building blocks here and some energy. So how do they get the energy? Well, they use catabolic pathways. To do that, where they're breaking down other molecules. And so these molecules are often just referred to as food, but we have nutrient molecules, food molecules, gases like oxygen need to come in. They combine together with enzymatic processes to release their energy and break down into smaller products that can then be built up into macromolecules. Some of the energy released from the catabolic pathways does end up as heat, and so we need to watch out for that one. So let's have a look at then the differences between autotrophic and heterotrophic. So the autotrophic organisms can use light energy to make their own food molecules as well. So that's where we have photosynthesis happening in plants. And so in terms of the molecules they're taking up, they're more nutrients that they, or basic building blocks that they can build up into high energy molecules and make their own food. Whereas for heterotrophic organisms, such as us, we get our high energy molecules from our food. So this part of the process here, where something's traveling into the cell across the membrane, that's where we get a bit tricky. And there's a few different ways that can happen depending on the type of molecule it needs to get in. So here the plasma membrane, you can see is made up of phospholipids. So that's a phospholipid molecule, and that forms a layer. And on the other side, we have the other layer. So that's why we call it a phospholipid bilayer. These molecules aren't attached to each other. They just self-organize into these arrangements because we have a hydrophobic tail that wants to go in with the other hydrophobic tails away from the water, and hydrophilic heads that will touch both the internal space and the external space, which are aqueous or water fluid environments. So the hydrophobic tails point in and the hydrophilic heads can touch the outside. Because of the small gaps between here, some certain small molecules can travel in by diffusion. Oh my goodness, by diffusion across that membrane. And so this would refer to small non-polar molecules. So polar refers to the bonds have an equal share of the electrons on either side if it's non-polar, and so it doesn't really have a charge. So these are uncharged molecules, oxygen, CO2, nitrogen, can diffuse in or out of cells. Uncharged but still slightly polar molecules that are small, like water and glycerol, can also diffuse in and out, but not as easily. And then if it's large, like glucose, can't fit through there, can't enter the cell unless it has a protein channel to go through. And even though these ions are very small, because of their high charge, they are repelled by the charged heads of those phospholipids, and they also can't pass in, so very low permeability. So depending on the size and charge, different things come into the membrane, so we call it semi-permeable. So what if you can't go in by diffusion? So when we look at transport across membranes, there's a passive form of transport that doesn't require ATP. Diffusion is for small molecules. Facilitated diffusion is the one where I said you need to have a protein channel to allow that to go in, and when water's going in or out, we call that osmosis. These are passive, don't require energy, because the molecules there go down what's called a concentration gradient, from high concentration to low concentration. So if it's high concentration of oxygen outside the cell, it can diffuse into the cell. If there's a high concentration of CO2 inside the cell, it can diffuse out of the cell, and neither of those require any energy. If you want to go against the concentration gradient, so you've got a high concentration of ions inside the cell, but you want to pump more in, then you're going to need a protein pump. So if you're going against the concentration gradient, or like as I said, for an ion, it's not going to go through the membrane because of its charge, you need to have pumps, and they require ATP, and they're made of protein. For really big things, so if you're taking macromolecules into the cell or anything that's too big, then you're going to need what's called bulk transport, endocytosis and exocytosis, going into or out of the cell.